the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. Elsa Gallagher is their biologist, and Pete Berthelsen is the partnership director and also a co-founder for the organization. Their organization was founded on the ideal of being able to provide good free seed to landowners to improve the pollinator habitat in the areas. So they're going to talk to us about just another tool that we can add in South Dakota and across the country to improve our pollinator habitat, and in so working with our landowners. So I'm going to let them take that over at this time. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. I'm Elsa Gallagher, the biologist with the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. It's a sunny 64 degrees in Missouri today, and it was 72 yesterday. I don't know about y'all in South Dakota and other places, but it's probably a bit colder, I imagine. For today's webinar, I'd like you to use the chat button to start with to introduce yourself, just your name and your location and your affiliation. And then the Q&A button, please use that button to ask questions. We're going to go ahead and keep them until the end of the talk, and I will go through those questions and try and pool them together and get like questions answered. And we should have a good 10, maybe even 15 minutes at the end for you to address those questions to myself, Pete Berthelsen, or to Catherine at Pheasants Forever. So we're really happy you're on, and I will let Pete introduce himself a little bit more and introduce our program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Catherine and Elsa. So first thing, this webinar is being recorded today, so you should know that. We'll make that available like we do with all of our other webinars as well, so that you will be able to share it, and you'll also be able to let people that couldn't make the webinar today know how to get on. So I'm going to hide our panelists so that you can just see the webinar that we have in front of us. And with that, we're going to begin. So thanks for hopping on today, and we're excited to chat with you. So Catherine's coming to you from South Dakota. Elsa is coming to you from Missouri, and I'm coming to you from the Luss Hills of central Nebraska, a kind of rolling topography that was formerly mostly in grassland. And this is an area that's really kind of divided evenly between row crop production and rangeland. The farm and ranch that I have in central Nebraska is a pretty good representation of that rangeland and crop ground, primarily corn and soybeans. I'm an amateur beekeeper, have 6 hives, been doing that for a number of years, but what I really am is somebody that is very, very passionate about getting highly diverse habitat onto the landscape. And that's what both Elsa and I have spent our professional careers working on, providing guidance on how to prepare, establish, design, and manage habitat like you see in this image right here. And this is an image of Elsa and I at one of the projects that will be a good example of what we'll be talking about today, about how this will be another tool for your toolbox about how to get habitat like this established. As Elsa mentioned, throughout this webinar, please use the Q&A function that's located on the bottom of your screen and just pass a question along, and Elsa and Catherine will summarize these at the end, but this is an example of kind of how you would give a question. Just give us your name, where you're from, and then what the question is. So with that, let's chat just a little bit about today's audience. It's a pretty diverse group of folks that are on here today that are participating in this webinar, and it ranges all the way from resource professionals, the solar energy industry, private landowners, beekeepers, pollinator enthusiasts. Everybody is welcome to be on today's call or on today's webinar, but this was designed specifically for resource professionals, so we will get into some of the nuts and bolts about that aspect of things. And then tomorrow evening at 6:30 Central Time, we'll be doing another webinar that again is open to anybody, but is designed for a much broader audience that includes private landowners and things like that. So before we start, Elsa and I wanted to pass along to you a few foundational thoughts that we have that kind of drive and motivate our thinking about pollinator habitat. And I guess the first thought is that this is a really, really unique moment in time. We're at a moment in time where the general public has a heightened level of understanding that there are problems with pollinator health and habitat, whether that is honeybees and things like colony collapse disorder, or the recent news about monarch butterfly populations and the significant stresses that those are under. The general population not only has a heightened level of understanding, but they have a heightened level of interest in doing something to correct those problems. That offers a really unique moment in time and an opportunity. And all you have to do is look at things like the New York Times writing an article about monarch butterflies to know that the public has a very different perception about what's going on. The next foundational thought is that as soon as you call something pollinator habitat, everybody will have a picture in their mind of what they think pollinator habitat looks like. And typically, it's the image on the calendar in your office when you flip it to the month of July, this gorgeous flowering meadow. And we can absolutely get to that, but I think when we're talking about pollinator habitat, it's really important to set the expectations of what we're talking about and what it will look like. The next foundational thought is that not all pollinator habitat is created equal. Sometimes I think that people feel that because something is flowering means that it has pollinator value. And not all flowering plants provide the same kind of pollinator value. If you look down into the corner of this image and you see black-eyed Susan next to a common milkweed, these are things that would have very, very different pollinator value. Black-eyed Susan has minimal pollinator value, and common milkweed has a very higher level of pollinator value and is attracted to a really wide range of pollinator species. And we'll talk about some of those things later on. The next foundational thought is that if we try to solve pollinator health and habitat issues using the same set of tools and techniques that we used for the last decade or two, we will probably fail. We have to look at doing things differently. And all you really have to do is look at the very recent information about the estimate of the wintering monarch butterfly eastern population on the mountaintops in central Mexico. And when you look at those numbers and we consider what the national population goal is, 8 hectares on the mountaintops in Mexico, we have not reached 8 hectares for over a decade or two. And this year we're significantly below that. If we try to address these problems using the same tools that we've been using for the last decade or two, we're probably not going to be successful. And that's where this group called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, that probably most people on today's webinar have never heard of before. The way that this group goes about it is using some new innovation and some new techniques that we'll talk about today, and kind of a new way of delivering pollinator habitat that's proving to be very successful. And I guess the last foundational thought for you before we kind of begin is that because habitat, whether we're talking about pheasants or quail or pollinators or grassland songbirds, because habitat is increasingly being stressed. There's not enough of it around. When we get an acre of habitat, we need to strive to make it the absolute best acre that we can, because there's simply not enough of it to go around. So we need to really work to make it the best that we can. So pollinator habitat works, and it can work for a really wide range of issues, whether we're talking about endangered species like the rusty patch bumblebee or grassland songbirds, renewable energy, water quality, threatened and endangered species like the regal fritillary butterfly, right-of-ways, and a whole long list of other things. And that's a little bit of what we're going to chat about on this webinar as well. But pollinator habitat can work to connect every one of these broad issues. So let's chat and tell you a little bit about a young nonprofit that, again, most of you have probably never heard of before, called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. And the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is a new nonprofit that's working to get high quality pollinator habitat on the ground. And we do it in some unique ways, working on projects that are at least 2 acres in size or larger. It's open to private land, public land, corporate land. We'll give you some examples of that later in the webinar, but you should envision that and think about that as really any land can be eligible. There's a very simple online application that we'll process that we'll talk to you about. And every project receives one-on-one technical guidance and then access to free pollinator seed mixtures. And our primary habitat program that we use is a program that we call Seed a Legacy. And this is an example of a promotional flyer that we have for this. At the end of this webinar, if you would like to receive copies of this webinar to make available to people that you are working with, please enter that information into the Q&A function, and we will work to get those to you. The Seed a Legacy program is currently available in 12 states in the Midwest and Great Plains. And if you're looking at this map and the first thing that you say is, well, it's not even available in my area, know that this program started out working in 2 states and then went to 6 states and then to 10. And today it's at 12, and we're about ready to do another expansion. We know we need to be working in a much larger area, but we're trying to have controlled growth and expansion so that before we add on additional states, we're making sure that we are having a significant impact in the areas where we're working. And these 12 states were selected for a number of reasons, but 2 really high priority reasons that I can give you and show you right here. The first is their critical importance to commercial beekeeping and migratory beekeepers and where they take their bees for pollination services. And the second is their critical importance to the eastern monarch butterfly population recovery plan. And if you're on today's call and you are residing in an area that is red, orange, or yellow, you're living in an area that is critically important to be having a plan that will influence monarch butterfly population recovery. These aren't the only areas, but if you're in red, orange, or yellow, you are a very high priority for where monarch butterflies need habitat results to influence their population recovery. So the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund establishes pollinator habitat a little bit differently than perhaps any other conservation program that you've worked with before. And what we do is we take every project and we divide it into 2 halves. And on half of the project, we establish what we refer to as a honeybee mix. And on the other half, we establish what we call a monarch butterfly mix. And let me tell you a little bit more about those seed mixtures. The monarch butterfly mixture is designed with 100% native plant species, a minimum of 40 wildflower species, more commonly probably 60 to 65 wildflower species, and designed in a fashion to really maximize the pollinator benefits. A mixture like this is 2 to 3 years to really become well established. And it is designed with a philosophy that high diversity equals high quality. And before I go on every slide today, if you see this little camera icon that's down here in the lower left corner, that means that we have a pollinator habitat tip, a 2 to 5 minute video tip that's been developed for this one topic that we're chatting about here. So in this case, we have a pollinator habitat tip that talks about the importance of high diversity in pollinator plantings. And this slide right here, don't worry so much about knowing what the different names are that are in here. The main thing that we want to be able to show you in here is that the more plant species that you have in your seeding mixture, the more pollinator species you're going to be able to benefit. The more plant species means the more pollinator species that we benefit. So another way of looking at that is, because this was put together, this webinar with the South Dakota Pheasants Forever team, I want to show you what our South Dakota Monarch Butterfly seed mixture looked like for 2020, for last year. And you don't have to worry about all the names and things that are in here, because what I want to be able to show you is how seed mixtures were designed very specifically, thinking about how many seeds per square foot, what percentage of the seed mixture is grass, what percentage is forbs, how many different species do we have in each bloom period. And then also another factor that's really important is we give each one of our seed mixtures a pollinator value score that ranges from 0 to 5. And this mixture scored a 4.31, which is a pretty high score. And anybody can go to our website, click on your state, and you can review what that seed mixture looks like for your state, because the seed mixtures used in South Dakota are not the seed mixtures used in Minnesota, nor are they the mixtures used in Wisconsin. The seed mixtures are really developed specifically for each state and each location. And if you're a pollinator enthusiast, a private landowner that's on this webinar today, one of the things that I would personally encourage you is that if you want to do a pollinator project, that you make sure that the seed mixtures that you're going to use are designed just for your project. So it can consider the soil types you have, what your objectives are, what your budget are. And I would encourage you not to obtain pollinator seed mixtures from areas where it's a canned mixture that you get the same as what everybody else gets. And this particular topic will be covered in much greater detail on tomorrow night's webinar. So this is an example of what we refer to as our honeybee mixture. It establishes very, very quickly. This photo was taken 2 months after planting, establishes very quickly, and it does include clover species. They are naturalized, commonly used within agriculture, and have very, very high pollinator values. So we do include those in that half of the planting. And let's chat about that just a little bit, because I'm sure that there will be people on this webinar that are kind of going, I don't know how I feel about having clover species included, even if it's on half of it. Let's chat about that just a little bit. So here's an example of some important research that was done. This was looking at honeybees. And in this diagram, which I'll explain a little bit more, the size of the circle talks about and shows how much that pollen that was collected by the honeybees, how much they focused on this. So let me back up and say that in this study, researchers collected the pollen that bees brought back to the hive and did a DNA analysis and actually figured out which specific plant that pollen came from. So a small circle or a large circle indicates how much the bees were focusing on it. And then the length of the circles from right to left on the screen talks about how long throughout the growing season, from June to September, the bees were collecting that pollen. So when you look at this, there's a lot of introduced plant species that bees collect pollen from, but perhaps the three types of plants that they focused on the most were all clover species. Very important to honeybees and highly used by native bees as well. So those are certainly included in that half of our pollinator seed mixture. So how does the enrollment process take place for you to get seed? This is a screenshot of our website. When you go to beeandbutterflyfund.org, on the home screen, you'll see this button that says Seed a Legacy Habitat Program. And when you click on that button, it will take you through the application process, where the first thing you'll do is select when do you want to plant. Spring of 2021, fall of 2021, spring of 2022, etc. You'll pick your season for when you want to plant. You'll pick the state that you are applying for, and then you'll go through and there'll be a number of questions that you'll answer. And then you'll actually attach a couple photos of your project site, and that information goes straight to Elsa. And then she begins the process of administrating and working with every single one of those projects. In exchange for free seed, there is a very simple one-page agreement that we have. And if you take a little closer look at this, basically it says you'll plant 2 seed mixtures, and you won't combine the seed. You'll plant them in 2 separate plantings. You'll perform weed control on it. You'll post 2 signs on it, and you'll maintain this project for 5 years. That's about it. It's not at all a burdensome contract or anything like that. So how could we go about establishing a project? So this is the point where, if you're a resource professional, I kind of want you to lean back and think about the number of people that you might bump into that maybe don't qualify for some other conservation programs out there. And I'm going to give you some examples of how the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund could work with them, with you and your efforts. So in this example, let's look at a 6-acre field. Could be as simple as I plant 3 acres of the honeybee mix on one half of it, and 3 acres of the Monarch Butterfly mix on the other half of it. Could be that simple. Or we could do something where we take that same 6-acre field and we plant the honeybee mix around the outside of the project, with the Monarch Butterfly mix in the middle, so that that honeybee mix serves as a green fire break, so that when we want to apply prescribed fire as a management tool in the future, we're more able to safely conduct a prescribed burn. Think of a project like that with like a castle with a moat around it. That green fire break, that honeybee mix planting that works just like a green fire break, like we have in this photo right here, can really be a great tool to help us be able to put fire on the ground in a more safe manner. So here's another example. Just say there's somebody on here today that's like, well, boy, this is great, and I'm in the state, but the state that they would work with, but I don't have 2 acres. Well, how about if you have 1 acre or whatever size, and then across the fence you have a neighbor that has another acre and similar interests? We'll be so flexible as to work to be able to combine projects to get to that minimum 2 acre size. And just know that one of the things that we do is we work really, really hard to find a reason to say yes. If the project can have a good pollinator outcome, we want to find a reason to say yes. We don't want to have programmatic reasons to say no, like you don't have a cropping history, your adjusted gross income is too high. We want to find reasons to say yes if we can have a good pollinator habitat outcome. So the number one criteria of the projects that we take is whether or not the site preparation is in place. And just to kind of put this in perspective to you, I'll tell you that we have never not provided free seed mixtures to a project that has the site prep fully in place. 100% of those have received our support. So I want to talk just a little bit about something we'll go into a lot more detail in tomorrow night's webinar, but many of the applications that come to us are areas that are currently in grass, and that is the most challenging platform to convert and establish into high quality pollinator habitat. So one of the things that we do with every project we work with is we start out at the top and work our way down. And we start out with our recommendations that we refer to as the gold plan. And in the gold plan of site preparation, it's taking an area that's in existing grass. And what we do is we actually, for one growing season, establish it to Roundup ready soybeans. This might not work on every project, but we want to just briefly tell you about this. This is an example of a city lot. The house in the background owned the adjoining lot, and the landowner got tired of mowing it every 7 to 10 days and really wanted to do something to benefit pollinators. We actually took this city lot that was in grass, established it to soybeans for one growing season, and at the end of that growing season, the adjoining landowner that planted it harvested the soybeans, and then we planted our pollinator plantings as a dormant seeding into that soybean stubble. And this works phenomenally for a number of reasons. All of the reasons that are kind of showing up on the screen right here really set this method aside as producing the best results in year 1, in year 5, and in year 10. It produces the best results. So on tomorrow night's webinar, we'll go into this and other options in more detail, but that's what we refer to as the gold plan. So if you're a resource professional on this call, one of the things that you might be thinking is, well, I wonder how they're able to afford to do all of this. And this is the point in the webinar that I want to let you know that we consider ourselves to be a big tent. And here's an example of what I mean by a big tent. I'm going to kind of run you through the length, the breadth, and the width of many of the different financial supporters that we have that range all the way from food industry, Costco, Whole Foods, and others, to retail corporations that include things like Target, Pura Vida bracelets, the solar energy industry, and others, to the beekeeping industry, commercial beekeepers, the honey packing industry, beekeeping supply companies, to foundations and nonprofits that range from the Girl Scouts to Next Era Energy, to crop commodity groups, corn growers, National Potato Council, and now we're talking with one of the national soybean groups about them becoming a supporter as well, all the way to agricultural industry, some of the very significantly large corporations in the country, Bayer, Syngenta, and others. And this is not, this whole list I just gave you is not meant to be a complete list of all our supporters. It's meant to show you the look and the feel for the type of support that we get. And I always like to show this because I don't think that there are many examples in our world today where a company like Whole Foods would work with a company like Bayer. under the big tent of the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, all of these different groups, corporations, foundations, nonprofits can come together with their common interest in supporting pollinator habitat. So at this point in time, Elsa and I think it's important to say both what we are, which we've just kind of talked about, but also what we are not. So what we are not is a pollinator habitat group that draws lines in the sand and says, we're good, you're bad, you have to stay on that side of the line and don't ever cross this line. Sometimes I feel like in the pollinator world, there are groups that draw lines in the sand and just simply don't want to work with some other groups. Has some things in ag industry, the technology of Roundup Ready crops and advancement in herbicides had a negative impact on pollinator health and populations? No question. Does that mean that those groups should not be part of the solution? We think that they should be part of the solution and work together with that very wide range of groups that we just showed you. Another thing that we are not is the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. This program that we're describing today is not about prairie restoration. And what I mean by that is both Elsa and I have a very strong passion about prairie restoration, but that's not what this program is about. This image is actually taken on the 95-acre native prairie that is on our farm and ranch that I love and means a great deal to me. We're absolutely huge supporters of prairie restoration, but that's not what this program is about. So we do not apply prairie restoration standards to how we go about doing projects. So moving on, we're very interested in documenting the benefits and the results of our pollinator habitat projects and the seed mixtures. And I'm excited to share one of those results with you. But right now we have 6 different research projects that are being conducted looking at the pollinator benefits of kind of how we design and implement our seed mixtures. And the first one that I want to tell you about is a project that it's just the furthest down the line. So we have the most results from this study. But this was a study where the U.S. Department of Agriculture hired the U.S. Geological Survey to conduct a research project that evaluated what the pollinator value was of the CP42 program. And in this study, USGS included Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund projects and seed mixtures in the study. And in this study, USGS looked at all the available pollinator habitat on the landscape, whether it's in a roadside or a pasture, a national wildlife refuge, the CRP program and their CP42 program specifically, anything that's out there that could be providing pollinator value. And one of the first things that they found is that in a bee and butterfly habitat project, we have about 2 times the number of flowers in a project. We had about 3 times the number of honeybee visits and usage of our pollinator projects. And something that I'm really happy about, 8 times the number of native bee visits and usage in a Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund project seed mixture compared to anything else that was out there on the landscape. And there are 5 more studies that will be coming up that we'll be telling you about in the future. So next, we just kind of want to wind this down by telling you that there's lots and lots of opportunity for how the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund can work on projects. And if you are a resource professional thinking about this, kind of lean back in your chair right now and think about the examples that Elsa and I are going to give you of the projects that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund has worked on in just the last couple of years. Obviously, private landowners are an increasingly important component of who we work with. This is an example of a project from Minnesota, and this photo was taken 15 months after the project was planted, and it was established following our gold plan. Another example of how that methodology produces great results. Wastewater treatment plants. We're working with municipalities that have a wastewater treatment plant, and then this large area of land that's in grass that they've been mowing every 7 to 10 days. And we're working with them to convert those areas to pollinator habitat so they have those benefits and they get to reduce their future mowing costs. Here's an example of a project. This happens to be from Michigan. And this is a regional airport that has a number of crop fields associated with this airport, which is fine. But they also, in a river right next to it, have a resident Canada goose population. And that resident Canada goose population loves to get up in the morning, fly across the river, and go and feed and loaf in these crop fields, which create the opportunity for bird strikes and Canada geese that are wandering around on the runway. So we've developed a project where we are establishing pollinator habitat in an objective plan with that airport to help keep Canada geese off the runway and reduce the potential for bird strikes. We're working with a number of states. South Dakota is one of them, where we are providing seed mixtures that are being planted on wildlife management areas. And we've done that in a number of states and would welcome the opportunity to work in even more. Solar energy, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about this. This photo is actually from a project that is located within Washington, D.C., where we are doing a solar project and establishing pollinator habitat underneath it on a project with DC Catholic Charities. And solar energy is an opportunity to establish pollinator-friendly habitat underneath ground-mounted solar panels. And we're currently working on projects in 17 states. We offer the technical guidance and then access to seed. And we're working on projects that range all the way from a private landowners project all the way to utility scale projects that are 180 megawatts in size. And for those of you that don't know what that means, that would be a project that's about 1,800 acres in size. And every solar project comes with some unique considerations and objectives. One of the most important is going to be, what's the lower panel height and how tall can the vegetation grow? Because in a solar project, we want to make sure we're designing that seed mixture so it will not grow taller than the lower panel height on the project. And we can do that in a great collaborative fashion. Here's an example of a real world energy project where we established our honeybee mix for use under the solar array. And then within the project property, but where there are not panels, we established our Monarch Butterfly mix. And then on this project, they actually brought in and established an apiary associated with the project. Works really, really well. And we can design and implement our projects in a way that checks all the boxes for what has to be considered as important in a solar energy project. We can check every one of those boxes and get great pollinator benefits on the landscape as well. We're doing projects with corporate campuses. This is one in Des Moines, Iowa, where we're establishing pollinator habitat with it, and it's also going to have hike bike trails associated with that area. This is an example of a project with a high school that's putting in a solar energy project to power the high school, and we're establishing pollinator habitat with that solar array. Right-of-ways, gas pipelines, roadsides, utility right-of-ways are another great example of where we can work to establish pollinator habitat. We're working with the Cincinnati Zoo and putting in a great demonstration project to let people know how those benefits can work together. In Iowa, we're even establishing pollinator habitat associated with a prison. Believe it or not, they followed the GOLD plan and are working to establish that. Different hike, bike, and park trail projects with communities. And I guess I'd just kind of conclude by saying that hopefully those examples kind of gave you the opportunity to think about how broad and wide we'd be able to work on projects like this and have the opportunity of kind of joining diverse interests and backgrounds and different objectives. So I'm going to close this up, and if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I wonder what I can do, I have a couple options for you. The first one is promote this program to landowners, because just like you may have never heard about this before this webinar today, very few landowners have. We'll be happy to give you our program flyers. If you're listening to this and you're a resource professional representing a different agency, a different state, we would love to do a pollinator webinar with you. We're just like the South Dakota Pheasants Forever team. You co-host a webinar with us that we promote and make available to more folks in your state, in your location that you work with, so they can learn about it. Again, we'll get those Seed a Legacy flyers to you. Just send that to Elsa in the Q&A section. And then like and follow us on social media. We're on all of those different platforms as well. And here's a heads up that in the near future, the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is producing a guide, a pollinator habitat establishment and management guide. Will be available free of charge. It will talk about all kinds of things like the GOLD plan, and just take people through a very detailed step-by-step process about site preparation, seed mixture designs, how to plant, future management, and we'll make all that information available. If you signed up for this webinar, you will now be on a list where you will automatically receive our different pollinator habitat tip videos that come out once a month. And again, it's a 2 to 5 minute video that will talk about a different topic. You'll be on a email distribution list to get that. If you decide you don't want to get that, it's a very simple unsubscribe process. You just click on a button at the bottom of it. But I think that these will be video tips that you will enjoy and be able to get something from, and also share with others that you're working with. And again, you can check us out on all the different social media platforms. So ask your question in the Q&A function. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what your question is. And we're going to now turn this over to Elsa, and we will start to begin the process of answering your questions. And here is the information that I'll leave up so that you can know how to get a hold of us in the future. So Elsa and Catherine, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Pete. You can hear me now, correct?
Yep.
Great.
Sure can.
So we have several questions. Several of them focus related to the species composition of our seed mixes. So I'm going to start with Courtney. She's in South Dakota, and she says a pollinator mix with 60 flowering species sounds amazing. Do you ever worry about too much competition that would choke some of those species out? Or do you have them at a rate low enough so that's not an issue?
Number one, Catherine, that's a great question.
Courtney.
So, Courtney. So it's a great question that will require a long answer that I'll try to make into a short answer. The first thing is that if I was able to go back and show you our seed mixture, That was a mixture that's developed using a calculator that looks at each species in there and what the individual seeding rate is based on the number of seeds per square foot. And I can tell you that every seed mixture is developed thinking about how quickly will they establish, how will they persist in the seed mixture, what's the balance between grasses and forbs. So we try to take all of those things into consideration, and there will be important pollinator species that you'll not find in the seed mixture. I'll give you an example. If you're to look at that, you won't find violets in our seed mixture. An incredibly important pollinator plant, specifically for regal fritillary butterflies. That's their host plant. But number one, starting violets from seed is very, very hard. And number two, they're going to need really kind of a specific habitat, and they're going to need a certain amount of elbow room to be able to show up in a mixture. So while it's a really important pollinator plant, it's specifically not included in our mixtures because we don't think that it would establish and persist and provide that value.
Great, Pete. And we had another kind of an anonymous question, an anonymous attendee question. How many species are ideal for one seed mix?
Well, the answer there is going to be in the eye of the beholder a little bit. Before I give my answer, I'm going to tell you, remember the graph that we had that said the more diversity, the more different plant species, the more different kinds of pollinator species you'll benefit from. You'll be able to benefit. So more is better. So my answer is such that if you were thinking about prairie restoration, you're probably going to think 200 or 300 plant species is what you need. If you were in a USDA conservation program, you might be towards the minimum of 6 or 7 or 9 different wildflower species in a mixture. We've kind of struck the balance in the middle of having a minimum of 40, and more often it's like 60 or 65. And then going back to Courtney's question, it was Courtney, right? Courtney's question, designing that seed mixture, thinking about what the value will be, but how it will function in terms of establishment, competition, and how it will persist into the future. So that's kind of the sweet spot that we've hit that we think works really, really well. And the early research results are bearing that out, that we have really, really high pollinator value in our seed mixtures.
Great. Dan asked you the question, Pete. What if the client's already enrolled in CRP? So we're talking an existing stand or the EQIP program, and they would just like to diversify their mix. It isn't necessarily about getting the free seed, but getting a diverse blend. Is it possible for them to get seed and supply assistance?
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions in what Elsa gave me, which is usually how she does it for me. She's bundling her questions again.
Like the bundle.
That's right. So the first thing is, if you're not in our 12 states, but you're interested in this, number one, the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund can design and supply seed for you. You can purchase it through us. So that number one, that's part of the answer on this CRP and EQIP question that you gave us, Elsa. Yeah, if they are interested in a much more diverse kind of seed mixture and adding to an established project, we can absolutely work with them on helping make that available to them for purchase. But they should know that interseeding into something that is already established is it's an uphill battle. You're talking about seedlings, a seed that germinates, starts to grow, becomes a seedling, having to compete in this established stand. And lots of times there just isn't enough elbow room. and there's competition above ground for resources like sunlight, moisture, and then there's competition below ground where that established stand has a root system that has kind of filled the soil horizon that provides competition as well. So the answer is yes, we can work on that with folks to try and help, but that's not typically through the Seed of Legacy program. That would not be how we would work that program.
Okay, Dan followed up, Pete, with just a little bit more. He's going to add to that question. Interseeding has a pretty poor success rate, he says. His question was for a brand new planting. So if they wanted to really increase that diversity as a brand new planting.
Yeah, so Dan has hit on a scenario that absolutely would work and would help. So yeah, so that's an opportunity. The Seed of Legacy program and the free seed it's complicated for us to use 2 seed mixtures. Remember, we use two different seed mixtures, and to plant those and to have that fit within the design of a USDA conservation program. It can work, and it has worked, but it's complicated and it's hard. But if somebody just said, hey, you know, I'm interested in doing more for pollinators, and can you kind of design something for us that I could just purchase to add to that? That's an easy yes.
Great. And Pete, Philip asked the question, is there a resource that identifies the best pollinators by state or region? And Philip, I didn't know whether you meant pollinator plants or pollinator species, so I'm going to go with plants, Pete.
Yeah, so you know, there are a number of things out there, but they're kind of scattered to the 4 winds. And if you think about some of the different groups that are out there that have developed some of those resources, Xerces Society has done some of that information by region. If you look at groups like Monarch Joint Venture, they have great educational resources where they provide some of that information. The best thing that I can tell people is if you have the opportunity, look around your area at natural plantings, natural areas, and see what grows there and that sort of thing. That's going to allow you to select plants that excuse me, grow in your area. 2, will handle the soil type in your area. And then 3, you'll have the opportunity to kind of see what they look like and maybe even be able to figure out what pollinator species are using those flower resources. So that's the best. Just kind of see what's happening in your own backyard and in your city, your county, your region of the state.
Great. I'm just going through, there's a lot of questions that seem a bit similar, so I'm just trying to help pull them together. While I'm doing that, I'm going to give you a Chris Hensey's question about, can you chat about how you manage invasive or noxious species under solar panels in regards to prescribed fire and herbicides? Those are difficult locations to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. So
very short people, very short people, Chris.
So number 1, it really is all about site prep. So one of the things, and that's whether it's a solar project or whatever, if you have invasives, noxious, unintended early successional plants that show up, it really is all about site prep. And that's why if you go back to in the middle of this presentation, I talked about how Elsa and I work on projects to make sure that site prep is fully in place. And that may well mean that a year or more is put into proper site prep because it's just that important. So the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is excited about working on solar projects because during the construction process of developing a new solar energy area, a project, site prep can pretty well be well put in place and we can feel real good about it. So site prep is the most important, and then designing a seed mixture that not only works with every objective of that solar project, but provides great pollinator value, establishes quickly, will only grow to a certain height, does have great pollinator value. All those things coming together are important to get it done right, because management is a challenge on solar areas. We're never going to be doing prescribed fire on a solar project. That's not going to happen. So it really comes down to, you have three tools, in my opinion: mowing, herbicide application, or potentially grazing with sheep. That's about it. So we really want to get it right on the very front end, so that we can make sure that we're getting those pollinator benefits in addition to all the other things for solar energy throughout the life of that 20 to 30 year contract that that solar energy project has.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have time for one more question here. If your question does not get answered today, because there's multiple and we're almost up to our hour, please send us an email. You've got our contact information right there, and we'll follow up with you. But the last one I'm going to go for, Pete, is Hannah had asked, she's from South Dakota. The question, she's a DC with NRCS. She's had a lot of producers ask about planting some monarch habitat on real steep ditch next to the county highway.
Mm-hmm.
And she's concerned that without the larger grass component to, I guess, to hold the soil, how would we be able to do that? Is there a slope limitation for these pollinator plots?
Yeah, and the answer is could be, depends. But the first way I'm going to answer this is I'm going to go back to one of the things that we mentioned in the webinar, is about how a pollinator seed mixture and the recommendations that you give should be designed for that individual project. And this is a great example of why. We want to look at the soil type. We want to look at, the slope, the topography, and all the different objectives that they have for that project. And then we want to think about, okay, how quickly do we need something to establish? That's going to inform how we design our seed mixture. What's the slope, that sort of thing. How was the site prepared? Is there even if the vegetation was terminated, is there an existing root system in the soil, that sod, that's still going to hold that soil in place to control erosion and things like that? Those are all factors that have to come together and be combined to think about what the technical guidance is and how the seed mixture should be designed. So the answer the more simple answer is, yeah, we want to get an acre of habitat wherever we can, and we want to make it the best it can be, but we have to think about that unique individual project and how we do it.